Hello folks, Jeffrey Daugherty, the Christian Whistleblower, back for part 2 of my recent interview with George Noory on Coast to Coast AM. If you missed part 1, you missed George and I talking about, you missed George asking me about the definition of the Mandela effect and whether or not I believe that it meant that we are bouncing between different realities. So are we, as a result of the Mandela effect, bouncing between different realities, universes? Well, watch part 1 of this video to find out. And we also talked about why doesn't everyone get affected by the Mandela effect? Why is everyone not affected by the Mandela effect? And we also talked about a stunning, I dare say a staggering prophecy of the Mandela effect in the Bible itself. That's right, a 3,000-year-old prophecy that foretold with exacting detail a technologically driven event and then pegged it to our day. So very, very interesting, very, very powerful. So go back and watch part 1 of Coast to Coast AM, Mandela Effect and Antichrist with yours truly and George Noory. And George asked me as we were going into the middle of the first segment, and we'll finish up the first segment here today, then we'll probably have a couple more broadcasts to finish up the second hour. And George asked me, Jeff, with all of your studies into the Bible, with being an expert on the book of Revelation and the Apocalypse, what scares you? What are you afraid of? I thought it was a very insightful question. And as I pondered it, I realized that back when I was a Pentecostal evangelist, back when I was within big-time religion, I was scared of a lot of things. I was afraid that the original sin that I was born with would overtake me and overpower me. I was filled with guilt for being a dirty, rotten sinner, for being part of the reason that had put Jesus on the cross. I felt guilty for that, and I felt fearful that somehow, some way I wouldn't measure up in the end. Maybe I wouldn't do enough. Maybe when the rapture occurred, I might be stealing a stick of gum or something. Or possibly, it could be even worse, I could be a bad person, miss the rapture, and then refuse the mark of the beast and die in the tribulation and burn forever in a lake of fire. Modern day, big time Pauline Christianity is a fear and guilt control matrix. And the reason we feel the guilt and the reason we feel the fear is because we are imprisoned by the Stockholm Syndrome, the spiritual Stockholm Syndrome. So as I shared with George, since I have come out of the guilt and fear matrix, since I have realized that I'm not born with original sin, but I'm filled with the spark of divinity within, since I have realized that I do not have anything to fear, that Yeshua hasn't given me the spirit of fear, but he's given me his peace, peace that passes all understanding, and he's given me some ways and truths that lead to not only life, but life more abundant. There's nothing that I fear. And I relayed that to George, and I think he was very taken by my statements. And then he asked me, but Jeff, what about the Antichrist? Aren't you afraid of the Antichrist? And I understand exactly where George was coming from, because 99.9999999% of you are coming from the very same place. You think the Antichrist is some end-time boogeyman, superhuman bad guy because you bought into the Hollywoodization, you bought into the weaponization, you bought into the Draculaization of the Antichrist. And the biblical definition of Antichrist simply means against the anointed or against the Christ. Christ means the anointed one. Antichrist means against the anointed one. Yeshua was the anointed one. And any one person or thing, I should say everyone, every person, everything, that is against the original teachings of Yeshua is, by definition, Antichrist. That's why my first book, that in fact George Noory wrote the foreword to, was called Apostle Paul Antichrist. Not because I think the Apostle Paul is going to be some end-time boogeyman, but I believe, along with President Jefferson and many other luminaries throughout history, well, I should say several other, not many, believe that, in Jefferson's terms, that Paul was the first great corrupter, the Coryphaeus, if you will. That's what Jefferson called him, the first great corrupter of the doctrines of Christ. And that made Paul the first Antichrist, the original Antichrist, and probably the prototypical Antichrist. But if you'll go back and listen to some of these videos, you'll see that Paul is not the ultimate embodiment of the Antichrist, and we're going to get into that as we got into it on Coast to Coast on Thursday night. Really Friday morning. It was about 3 in the morning here on the East Coast when I finally got on the air. But George asked me, is the Antichrist part of the Mandela effect? And with all due respect and in all humility, I say absolutely 100% positively, because Daniel said that he is absolutely 100% positively central to the Mandela effect. In the scriptures that we talked about in the last video, we talked about Daniel saying this person that he called he, would think to change time. He would think to change specific events and notable characteristics of time. He would think to create multiple timelines. And doing it all to prevent disclosure, doing it all to prevent spiritual disclosure from us learning things, doing it to prevent even technological and scientific disclosure that would be beneficial to humanity. So yes, the Antichrist, in the words of Daniel, is central to the Mandela effect. And I just thought about this today. Didn't think about it when I was on Coast. I wish I would have. But in the Field of Dreams Mandela effect, we know that the Field of Dreams used to say, if you build it, they will come. Now it says, if you build it, he will come. And I can't help but wonder if the prophet Daniel was not so insightful that he was able to peg with staggering certainty one of the Mandela effects with that great specificity. And think about it, folks. A lot of time these people that do these things, and the Antichrist, if he is who I think he is, and if you've listened to me for any length of time, you know who I think he is, and I'll get more specific on that as we go through it, it would be perfectly within his character to mock the words of the great prophet Daniel, who you'll remember escaped the lion's den. So yes, Antichrist is part and parcel with the Mandela effect. And then George asked, what kind of an effect did I believe that social media has had on the Mandela effect? And of course, the Mandela effect is essentially a social media driven phenomenon, if you will. Were it not for Twitter, Facebook, and all the other social media platforms, we probably wouldn't have heard of the Mandela effect in as great a way as we have. And Daniel even looked at that. He said people would travel great distances in amazingly short periods of time. And you think about it, last night on Coast to Coast AM, George was in Los Angeles. I was in Orlando, Florida, and we were together. And there were people listening. We had a caller from the UK. We had a caller from Canada. That's people all over the world getting together in a very short time. So when you think about it in these terms, the prophecy of Daniel regarding the Mandela effect becomes even more spectacular. And were there some Bible verses, I was asked, that the Mandela effect has changed? I talked about there were a couple of them. I have made a series of videos, the Mandela effect and Antichrist. You can go back and look at those. In fact, it's a playlist on my YouTube channel. And you can also go to jeffreydarty.com. And remember, there is a Mandela ebook at jeffreydarty.com that you can get that has all of this information in very deep and specific details. And then George asked about the final message of the last apostle, which is a book that I wrote that I talked about on Coast to Coast. And he really liked it. And he said, Jeff, the word apocalypse scares me. Can you help me with that? And I said, George, you're like everybody else, but did you know that the word apocalypse doesn't mean fire raining from heaven, doesn't mean people dying, doesn't mean fear? The word apocalypse simply means unveiling. And he said, I'm one of the only people he knows that has a positive outlook on the end of days and on biblical prophecy. And that's because I've had an unveiling. I'm no longer under the fear and guilt matrix of big-time Christianity and Pauline Christianity. I'm following the original Yeshua movement, the man that said, I don't give you fear, but I give you peace, and peace that passes all understanding. A man that said, here's some ways, here's some truths that will lead you to life and life more abundantly. I've had that unveiling. I've had my apocalypse, the apocalypse of Yeshua. You can have the apocalypse of Paul if you want it. I'll stick with the apocalypse of Yeshua. That's why I fear nothing. That's why I have a positive view of the end of times. Folks, this is what happens. This is why I do what I do, so that you, my friends, can learn to unindoctrinate yourselves.